It was a test, cruel, calculated, and cold. But perhaps what made it most devastating was that Alexander Ashworth didn't even realize he was testing himself just as much as her. In the silence of a marble-floored mansion that sprawled across 12 acres of manicured Pacific Northwest landscape, beneath a glittering Austrian crystal chandelier that had once graced the ballroom of European royalty and cost more than most people's homes, and the soft, methodical ticking of a 200-year-old grandfather clock that had survived 3 generations of family betrayals, business scandals, and broken promises, a safe stood wide open in the master's study like a gaping wound exposing the beating heart of wealth itself. The safe was a custom-built German masterpiece, steel and titanium with biometric locks that normally required both fingerprint and retinal scans to open. It stood 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, an imposing monument to security and paranoia. Inside, bundles of cash lay stacked like green bricks of temptation, $50,000 in crisp hundreds that still smelled of ink and possibility, glinting beside ropes of South African diamonds that caught light like captured starfire, 24-karat gold coins from various centuries that told stories of empires risen and fallen, and bearer bonds worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander. Here was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, yet it represented barely a fraction of his worth. Pocket change in a fortune that Forbes had once estimated at close to $200 million. Money that had come from real estate empires, tech investments that had paid off beyond imagination, and the kind of financial instincts that turned thousands into millions and millions into generational wealth. He knew she would pass through here. He knew her schedule down to the minute, 8:42 a.m. every Wednesday, dusting the study with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. He had studied her routine with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, noting every movement, every habit, every small ritual that marked her passage through his carefully ordered world. The man, a millionaire twice over by inheritance and 5 times over by his own ruthless business acumen that had earned him respect and fear in equal measure, stood hidden just beyond the hallway arch, his breath shallow and controlled, eyes narrowed not with anger, but with the kind of quiet anticipation that comes from years of disappointment, crystallizing into cynicism so complete it had become a second skin. His expensive Italian leather shoes, handcrafted by artisans in Florence who made only 12 pairs per year, made no sound on the Persian rug that had been woven by master craftsmen and cost more than most people's cars. The rug itself told stories, threads of silk and gold that had taken 2 years to complete, patterns that carried the history of ancient trade routes and royal courts. In his perfectly manicured hand, nails buffed to a subtle shine by a manicurist who visited twice weekly, he held a small recording device, not for evidence, but for his own twisted need to capture the moment when another person's mask would inevitably slip, when their true nature would reveal itself in all its disappointing predictability. Alexander had become a student of human failure, a connoisseur of the moment when integrity crumbled under pressure. He had seen it happen so many times. The trusted accountant who skimmed thousands before disappearing to the Cayman Islands. The business partner who sold proprietary information to competitors for a fraction of its worth. The housekeeper who stole jewelry and tried to pawn it 3 states away. Each betrayal had added another layer to his armor, another reason to believe that everyone had a price, everyone had a breaking point, everyone was ultimately looking out for themselves. And yet, as he watched his housemaid enter the room and pause before the open safe, her reflection caught in the polished mahogany of his grandfather's desk, a piece that had witnessed decades of family meetings, business deals, and personal disappointments. He never imagined that what would unfold in the next few minutes would utterly unravel him, breaking open a heart he didn't know he still possessed, and revealing truths about himself that would haunt and heal him for years to come. The housemaid's name was Camila Rodriguez, 32 years old, slender but strong in the way that comes from years of physical labor and emotional resilience, reserved but not broken, with deep brown eyes that held the weight of stories she never told, and pain she carried with grace that would humble saints. She had been working in the Ashworth estate for just over 7 months, long enough to learn every corner of the mansion's 43 rooms, every preference of its reclusive owner, every shadow and light pattern that marked the passage of days, but not long enough for him to truly see her as anything more than efficient, invisible help. Her story was written in the calluses on her hands and the determined set of her shoulders. A widow with two young daughters, Sophia, 7, and Isabella, 5, and a mother battling stage 3 pancreatic cancer with the kind of fierce dignity that runs in families of strong women. Camila was the kind of person who moved silently through pain, carrying burdens that would crush others while still managing to smile at her children each morning, to pack their lunches with little notes of encouragement, to help with homework at a kitchen table that served multiple purposes in their tiny apartment. Her husband, Miguel, had died in a construction accident 2 years earlier when scaffolding collapsed during a routine job on a downtown office building. The lawsuit had dragged on for 18 months, lawyers taking their fees while medical bills piled up like accusations. In the end, the settlement barely covered the funeral costs and outstanding debts, leaving Camila to rebuild a life from scratch while carrying the additional weight of her mother's illness and her daughter's needs. The irony was bitter. Miguel had been working on a building that would house luxury condos selling for millions, creating wealth for people who would never know his name or acknowledge his sacrifice. Now Camila cleaned the homes of those same wealthy people, invisible labor that maintained their comfort while she struggled to pay rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots occasionally punctuated bedtime stories. Every morning she arrived before sunrise in her beat-up Honda Civic that wheezed and protested, but somehow kept running on prayers, determination, and the kind of mechanical sympathy that comes from necessity. The car had 180,000 miles on it and needed repairs she couldn't afford, but it was her lifeline to the job that kept her family housed and fed. She would sit in the parking area behind the mansion for a few minutes before starting work, looking at a photo of Miguel taped to her dashboard, gathering strength for another day of invisible labor in someone else's world. She would tie her thick dark hair back into a perfect bun secured with bobby pins she bought in bulk at the dollar store, slip into her simple gray uniform that she washed and pressed herself each night while her daughters did homework at the kitchen table, and begin her tasks without complaint, hesitation, or the slightest hint that she was drowning slowly in a sea of impossible circumstances that seemed to grow deeper rather than shallower with each passing month. Her uniform told its own story, carefully mended tears that spoke of pride and poverty in equal measure, fabric that had been washed so many times it was soft as silk but strong as determination. She had 3 identical uniforms that she rotated, each one maintained with the same attention to detail she brought to her work, because appearance mattered in a world where being invisible required being perfect. To most visitors to the Ashworth estate, business associates, society friends, delivery people who glimpsed the mansion's opulence, she was invisible, a shadow behind silver trays and polished marble, present but unseen, efficient but unremarkable. They might nod politely if they encountered her in the hallways, but their eyes would slide past her as if she were furniture, part of the machinery that kept wealthy lives running smoothly. But to Alexander Ashworth, the reclusive millionaire who had inherited wealth but never earned peace, never found love that lasted beyond the calculation of prenuptials, never trusted without being betrayed in ways that left scars on his soul, Camila had become a mystery that had begun to haunt his carefully structured days and disturb his sleepless nights. There was something about her that didn't fit the patterns he had learned to recognize. She didn't exhibit the telltale signs of hidden resentment that he had come to expect from domestic staff. No lingering glances at expensive objects, no subtle questions about his wealth, no attempts to ingratiate herself through false familiarity. She seemed genuinely unimpressed by displays of wealth that usually provoked either obvious envy or calculated flattery. Alexander had spent most of his 45 years building and protecting his empire with the single-minded focus of a man who learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, that vulnerability was an invitation for exploitation, that every relationship was ultimately transactional. His father had taught him that lesson with brutal efficiency, using affection as a reward for achievement and withdrawing love as punishment for failure, until young Alexander learned to armor his heart against disappointment. The lessons had been reinforced throughout his life with devastating consistency. People had stolen from him. His first business partner, a college roommate he had trusted with his life, embezzled $500,000 through a series of clever accounting tricks before disappearing to Costa Rica with a new identity and Alexander's faith and friendship. People had betrayed him. His younger brother sold family secrets to competitors for a fraction of what they were worth, choosing immediate gratification over long-term loyalty and destroying their relationship forever. People had used him with calculated precision, too many to count, each leaving scars that accumulated like sediment in his soul until he could barely remember what it felt like to trust another human being completely. Business associates who smiled at board meetings while sabotaging deals behind his back. Friends who disappeared when he needed support, but reappeared when they needed favors. Women who saw his bank account before they saw his face, who performed affection with Academy Award precision until the moment they decided they could get more in divorce court than in marriage. His ex-wife, Victoria, had been the cruelest lesson of all. Beautiful, intelligent, charming, she had played the role of loving wife for 3 years, while systematically documenting his assets, building a case for maximum extraction when she inevitably filed for divorce. She took $12 million, along with the house in the Hamptons, the yacht that had been his one true luxury, and what remained of his faith in human goodness. The final insult had been discovering that she had been sleeping with his divorce attorney throughout the proceedings, turning even legal representation into a conspiracy against him. Former employees had siphoned funds through elaborate schemes that took forensic accountants months to unravel. Fake vendor accounts, inflated invoices, phantom consulting fees that lined pockets while bleeding his companies dry. Each discovery had been like finding another crack in the foundation of his world, another reason to retreat further behind walls of suspicion and skepticism. Even his own father, Harrison Ashworth III, had taught him that affection was conditional, that love was just another transaction waiting to be negotiated. Dinner conversations had been performance reviews. Birthdays had been opportunities for lectures about responsibility and achievement. Love had been doled out in measured doses, always contingent on meeting expectations that seemed to rise higher each time they were reached. And so Alexander built walls, steel ones around his vault, electronic ones around his property that could detect an intruder from half a mile away, legal ones around his assets that created layers of protection like Russian nesting dolls, and emotional ones around his heart that grew higher and thicker with each passing year until he could barely remember what it felt like to trust another human. Being completely to open himself to the possibility of genuine connection without calculating the probable cost of betrayal. When Camila arrived through the recommendation of Elite Domestic Services, an agency that specialized in discreet domestic help for high-net-worth individuals and conducted background checks more thorough than those required for security clearances, there was something different about her that Alexander couldn't quite identify. The difference was subtle but persistent, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect symphony. She didn't flatter him with the practiced charm of previous employees who had learned to recognize the power dynamics of wealthy households and played them like instruments. She didn't ask personal questions or try to engage him in conversation beyond what was absolutely necessary for performing her duties. She didn't seem impressed by the Picasso in the hallway worth more than most people's houses, or the Rolex collection in his bedroom that represented decades of acquisition, or the wine cellar that contained bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries. Her lack of reaction was so complete it seemed almost deliberate, as if she had trained herself not to see the wealth that surrounded her, not to calculate its value or covet its possession. Alexander found this more unsettling than obvious greed would have been, because it suggested a level of self-control that he wasn't sure he believed possible. She never lingered in rooms longer than her tasks required, never seemed to notice the casual displays of wealth that usually made people either awkwardly deferential or secretly resentful. She didn't photograph anything with her phone, didn't ask questions about the art or furnishings, didn't show any signs of the curiosity that wealth typically inspired in those who served it. And she was, by every record and background check his security firm could produce, painfully, almost suspiciously clean. No criminal history, no bad debt, no association with questionable people. Her references painted a picture of someone who was reliable, honest, and hardworking to a fault. Even her social media presence was minimal and unremarkable. Photos of her daughters, occasionally her mother, simple meals, nothing that suggested hidden vices or secret ambitions. It bothered Alexander in a way he couldn't articulate, the way her honesty felt almost threatening. Too pure to trust, too good to be real in a world where everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had a breaking point where their moral compass would spin wildly and point toward whatever benefited them most. The idea that this quiet woman with calloused hands and tired eyes might genuinely be as unshakable as she appeared felt like a challenge to everything he believed about human nature. Her very presence in his home had become a kind of reproach, a daily reminder that perhaps his cynicism was a prison of his own making, rather than a reasonable response to life's lessons. Every interaction with her left him slightly off balance, questioning assumptions he had held for decades about what people were really like when the masks came off and the stakes got high enough. That's when he devised the test. Not because he suspected her of anything specific, but because he needed to prove to himself that she was like everyone else, that underneath her serene exterior lay the same greed, the same willingness to compromise, the same fundamental selfishness that he had learned to expect from everyone who entered his world. He needed to confirm that his cynicism was justified, that his walls were necessary, that his isolation was wisdom rather than cowardice. The test would be simple and brutal. Place irresistible temptation in front of her when she believed no one was watching, and see what her true character looked like when it thought it was alone. He told himself it was practical, that he needed to know who he was trusting with access to his home, his possessions, his private space. But deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged even to himself, he hoped desperately to be wrong about her, and was terrified of being right. One Tuesday evening, just before she was scheduled to dust the study the following morning, Alexander arranged every detail with the precision of a chess grandmaster, planning a sequence that would end in inevitable checkmate. He instructed his security team to disable the hallway cameras temporarily. A system malfunction, they were told, nothing unusual in a house where technology occasionally conflicted with century-old wiring. The head of security, Marcus, raised an eyebrow but complied without question, long accustomed to his employer's eccentric requests. He positioned the safe to be left wide open, angled perfectly so anyone entering the room would see it immediately, impossible to miss or ignore. The safe's interior lights were still on, illuminating the contents like a theatrical spotlight on the props of temptation. He even scattered a few loose bills on the floor nearby, as if they had fallen carelessly from overstuffed bundles, adding to the appearance of oversight rather than intention. The staging was perfect, designed to look like the kind of wealthy person's carelessness that might happen when someone was in a hurry, distracted by phone calls and urgent business matters. It had to appear accidental because the test only worked if Camilla believed she had stumbled upon an opportunity rather than walked into a trap. No one would know this moment happened except him. This was his private laboratory, his personal examination of the human soul under pressure, his chance to finally see what Camilla would do when faced with unimaginable temptation and zero apparent consequences. He had run similar tests before, with previous employees, and they had all failed in predictably disappointing ways. This would be no different. Would she falter? Would she take even a single bill, justifying it as payment for extra work or compensation for underpayment? Would she look around furtively, calculating whether she could get away with it, weighing risk against reward? Would she count the money to see how much was there, perhaps taking only what she thought wouldn't be missed? Or was she truly as unshakable as she appeared, truly as immune to temptation as her perfect record suggested? Alexander told himself he was being practical, responsible, prudent, but as he prepared his hiding place and checked sight lines to ensure he could observe without being seen, he felt something he rarely acknowledged: shame. The test was cruel because it was designed to corrupt innocence, to force someone to choose between need and integrity under circumstances that were inherently unfair. But he pushed the shame aside, buried it under layers of justification and rationalization. Better to know now than discover later. Better to be disappointed by a test than devastated by betrayal. Better to confirm his cynicism than risk the alternative: hope. Wednesday morning arrived, gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that made the mansion feel more like a fortress than a home, its windows streaked with rain that transformed the outside world into impressionist watercolors. The weather matched Alexander's mood: overcast, heavy with anticipation, charged with the possibility of storms. Camilla arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., as she always did, parking her tired Honda in the designated area and sitting for a moment to look at Miguel's photo and gather strength for another day. She had worked late the previous evening at her second job, cleaning offices downtown after the business tenants left, and had gotten only 4 hours of sleep before her alarm pulled her from dreams of better times. She entered through the service entrance, hanging her coat in the small closet reserved for staff, and began her morning routine with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her work for 7 months. The mansion felt different in the early morning hours, more peaceful, less oppressive, as if the weight of wealth was somehow lighter when its owner was still asleep. She carried her supplies in a small wooden caddy that had belonged to her grandmother Elena, the same woman now fighting cancer in a hospital bed that cost more per day than Camila earned in a week. The caddy was practical but beautiful, worn smooth by decades of honest work, containing cleaning rags that had been her mother's, furniture polish that had been carefully chosen for each type of surface, and a feather duster that had seen better days, but still did its job perfectly. Her routine never varied. Windows first to catch the morning light, then surfaces from top to bottom, left to right, with the methodical precision of someone who took pride in work, regardless of whether anyone noticed. She moved through the mansion's rooms like a ghost of efficiency, leaving everything cleaner and more organized than she found it, never disturbing the careful arrangements that spoke of wealth and taste. When she reached the study at exactly 8:42 a.m., her movements carried the same quiet confidence they always did. The study was one of her favorite rooms to clean, books floor to ceiling, leather furniture that gleamed under her care, and the sense that important decisions were made here, that this room was the brain of the household's operations. She began with the windows that faced the garden, wiping away the moisture that had condensed overnight, transforming them from cloudy barriers into clear portals that let morning light flood the room. Then she moved to the massive bookshelf that contained first editions Alexander had inherited but never read, volumes of literature, history, and philosophy that represented centuries of human thought gathering dust like abandoned dreams. It wasn't until she turned toward the massive oak desk that had commanded the room for 3 generations that the morning sunlight hit the steel door of the safe and bounced a glare across the polished floor that made her stop mid-step, her routine interrupted by something that shouldn't have been there. Her duster froze in her gloved hand. Her breath caught in her throat audibly, a small gasp that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Alexander, hidden in the shadows of the adjacent hallway where he had positioned himself with military precision, felt his own pulse quicken as he watched her process what she was seeing. Her eyes went to the safe, then quickly to the hallway, scanning for signs of presence or surveillance. No one. Silence except for the grandfather clock marking time with its steady judgmental rhythm, and the soft patter of rain against windows that suddenly sounded like whispered accusations. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her throat, a gesture Alexander had never noticed before but would remember forever. A small tell that revealed her shock, her immediate recognition of the gravity of the moment, her awareness that she was standing at a crossroads that would define who she really was. For a long moment she stood perfectly still, staring at the open vault as if unsure whether to believe what she was seeing, as if the sight of so much money displayed so carelessly was somehow an hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. Alexander could see her mind working, could almost hear the questions forming. Was this a test, an oversight, a trap, opportunity disguised as accident? Her body language revealed nothing of greed or calculation, only confusion and something that looked remarkably like concern, not for the opportunity it represented, but for the problem it might indicate. She seemed worried rather than excited, as if her first thought was not, "How can I benefit from this?" but rather, "Something is wrong here." Alexander's heart pounded against his ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. Every muscle in his body was tense, every sense heightened, every instinct screaming that this was the moment of truth that would either confirm his cynicism or shatter it completely. His breathing had become shallow, controlled, as if too much oxygen might somehow give away his position or influence the outcome of his cruel experiment. She approached slowly, hesitantly, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian carpet. Her movements were careful, respectful, as if she were approaching something sacred rather than something to be exploited. There was reverence in her posture, a kind of spiritual caution that suggested she understood she was in the presence of something that could change her life forever. When she reached the safe, she paused again, her hands clasped in front of her in an almost prayer-like gesture, and Alexander realized with growing amazement that she was actually studying the contents, not with greed or excitement, but with something closer to worry and concern. Her expression was that of someone who had discovered evidence of a problem, not someone who had stumbled upon an opportunity. The money was right there, $50,000 in neat stacks that could solve every problem in her life, pay for her mother's treatment in full, secure her daughter's future, End the constant stress of wondering how she would make rent each month, or whether her car would start in the morning, or whether she could afford to take her daughters to the movies just once without calculating the cost. Against groceries. The temptation must have been overwhelming, like standing in the desert and being offered water, like starving and being offered bread. Alexander knew her financial situation from the background check, the medical bills, the overdue notices, the constant juggling of priorities that defined poverty in America. This money could change everything, could lift her family from the edge of desperation to something resembling security. Her fingers hovered just over the stacks of money for a moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when need would overcome principle, when desperation would trump integrity, when she would prove that everyone had a price and his cynicism was justified after all. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. She reached for the cleaning rag tucked into her apron and softly began wiping the safe's edge, careful not to smudge or shift a single bundle inside. She didn't count the money or calculate its value. She didn't glance around greedily or check for cameras. She didn't even seem to really see the wealth before her as something she could take. She simply wiped the dust off the steel with the same precision and care she used on every other surface in the mansion, treating it as just another part of her job, another responsibility in a day full of responsibilities. Her movements were gentle, almost tender, as if she were caring for something precious that belonged to someone else. And then something happened that would replay in Alexander's mind for months afterward, something that would change not just how he saw Camila, but how he saw himself, his assumptions, and the very nature of human character under pressure. Camila reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph, creased and worn from being handled countless times with love and longing. The paper was soft with age, the color slightly faded, but the emotions it captured were as vivid as ever. She glanced at the hallway once more, as if needing to be absolutely certain she was truly alone in this moment, and placed the photo on the shelf next to the stacks of cash. It was a picture that told an entire story in a single frame. Two little girls, Sophia and Isabella, maybe 7 and 5 years old, grinning with gap-toothed smiles that radiated pure joy, standing in front of a hospital bed where an older woman lay smiling weakly but genuinely. Camila's mother, Elena, during one of her better days between chemotherapy treatments when hope still outweighed despair and love still conquered fear. The girls were holding handmade cards that read, "Get well soon, Abuela," in crayon colors that had seemed so bright and hopeful when they were made, before medical bills started arriving like storm clouds, before the reality of stage 3 cancer set in, before hope became something that had to be rationed like medicine. In the photo, Elena's eyes still held light. Her smile still suggested that she believed in tomorrow, and the girls still thought love could cure anything. It was a moment frozen in time, a memory of when the family was complete and optimistic, before death started knocking on their door with increasing persistence. Camila whispered something so softly that even Alexander, straining to hear from his hiding place with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview hung in the balance, couldn't make out the specific words. But he could see her lips moving with the rhythm of prayer, could see the gentle reverence in her posture, and somehow knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't asking for money or for an easy way out. She was praying for strength, strength to keep making the right choices when the wrong ones would be so much easier, strength to continue carrying burdens that sometimes felt too heavy for her shoulders, strength for her mother's healing and her daughter's happiness, and her own ability to keep going when everything seemed to be falling apart. Then, with the tenderness of someone handling something infinitely precious, something worth more than all the money in the world, she picked up the photo again, kissed it softly with lips that trembled slightly with emotion, and placed it back into her pocket, right over her heart where it belonged. Without another glance at the money, without a moment of visible temptation or internal struggle, she closed the safe door with the same careful respect she might show closing a church door after prayer. Her movements were deliberate, reverent, as if she understood that she had been trusted with something sacred, and her job was to protect that trust rather than exploit it. Alexander stepped back into the shadows, stunned beyond words, his carefully constructed test crumbling around him like a house of cards in an earthquake. His hands were shaking, actually trembling, with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. His carefully controlled breathing had become ragged, and he felt something wet on his cheeks that he hadn't experienced in years. Tears that seemed to come from a place in his soul he thought had died long ago. These weren't the angry tears of betrayal or the bitter tears of disappointment that he had shed so many times before. These were something else entirely. Tears of recognition, of shame, of a kind of awe and wonder he hadn't felt since childhood, when the world still seemed capable of magic and miracles. He wasn't sure what he had expected from his cruel little test. A quick hand darting toward the money, fingers closing around bills that could change a life. A stolen 100 or 1,000 tucked quickly into a pocket with nervous glances toward the door. Maybe even a moment of visible hesitation or internal struggle that would at least acknowledge the temptation, even if it was ultimately resisted. What he had witnessed instead was something that shook the very foundation of his understanding about human nature, about what people were really like when they thought no one was watching, about the possibility that genuine integrity still existed in a world that seemed designed to corrupt it. He had seen reverence where he expected greed. He had seen love where he expected calculation. He had seen someone look at enough money to change her life forever, and see instead only another person's trust that needed to be protected. The photo, the quiet prayer, the gentle kiss, the safe left not just untouched, but actually cleaned with care. It was a kind of integrity so pure it felt almost mythical, like something from fairy tales rather than real life. The test had been designed to reveal Camilla's true character, but what it had actually revealed was his own. She had passed with flying colors, had, in fact, transcended the test entirely by turning it into something sacred. He, on the other hand, had revealed himself to be a man so damaged by past betrayals, so poisoned by cynicism, that he had lost the ability to recognize genuine goodness when it was literally cleaning his house every day. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt truly small, not because of what he lacked, but because of what he had found and almost missed, what he had nearly dismissed as impossible when it was actually right in front of him. He turned and walked away before she could finish her work and discover him there, before she could see the tears forming in his eyes, or witness the way his entire worldview was crumbling and reforming in real time. As he retreated to his bedroom, Alexander felt the weight of a revelation that was both liberating and terrifying. Everything he believed about human nature might be wrong. Every wall he had built, every assumption he had made, every cynical conclusion he had drawn from his experiences might be the result of looking for the worst in people, and therefore finding it, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that had isolated him from the very goodness he claimed didn't exist. That evening, Alexander couldn't sleep. He paced the marble floors of his mansion like a ghost haunting his own life, replaying the morning's events with obsessive detail, examining every gesture, every expression, every moment of Camilla's interaction with the open safe. The 43 rooms of his home felt simultaneously too large and too small. Too large because they echoed with loneliness, too small because they couldn't contain the magnitude of what he had witnessed. Every gesture played in his mind like a film he couldn't stop watching. The way she had paused when she first saw the safe, the concern rather than excitement in her expression, the gentle way she had wiped the steel clean, the reverence with which she had handled the photograph of her family. Each detail seemed to carry weight beyond its apparent significance, as if together they formed a message he was only beginning to understand. The photo haunted him most of all. The casual way she had placed it next to $50,000, as if it were worth infinitely more than all the money in the world. The kiss she had given it, so tender and full of love that it made his chest ache with recognition of something he had lost long ago. The ability to value what truly mattered over what could be counted and measured. The prayer whispered over money she could have taken but didn't, over wealth that could have solved her problems, but somehow wasn't even a real temptation. The way she had closed the safe like closing a sacred door, protecting something that didn't belong to her with the same care she would protect something precious of her own. The weight of it all settled on his chest like a truth he hadn't prepared to confront. It was no longer about the test if it ever really had been. It was about her, about the kind of character he had spent his adult life believing didn't exist in the real world. It was about the realization that he had judged everyone through the lens of his past wounds, and in doing so, had nearly lost sight of the rare goodness that had been standing quietly under his own roof for 7 months. But more than that, more uncomfortable and more important, it was about the recognition that the test had revealed more about him than about her. She had passed with flying colors, had transcended the test entirely by turning it into something sacred, He, on the other hand, had revealed himself to be a man so damaged by past betrayals that he had lost the ability to recognize genuine integrity when it was cleaning his house every day. He had become the kind of person who tested others' honesty, not because he needed to know for practical reasons, but because he had forgotten how to believe in it, forgotten how to hope for it, forgotten how to recognize it when it was right in front of him. He had built his walls so high that he could no longer see over them to the good that still existed in the world, still walked among ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they thought no one was watching. For the first time in years, Alexander felt ashamed, not of what had been done to him, but of who he had allowed those experiences to make him. He had become a prisoner of his own protection, isolated by defenses that no longer served him, hardened by cynicism that had outlived its usefulness, and become a barrier to the very connections that might heal the wounds it was meant to protect. The mansion felt different that night, as if Camilla's simple act of integrity had somehow changed the very air, charged it with possibility he had forgotten existed. Rooms that had felt like fortress chambers now felt like spaces that could potentially hold warmth, conversation, genuine human connection. The silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like emptiness waiting to be filled. As dawn approached, Alexander found himself standing in his study, looking at the safe that had been the stage for his failed experiment. The morning light hit it differently now, not highlighting its security features but revealing its emptiness, not of money but of meaning. What was the point of protecting wealth if it couldn't be shared, if it couldn't be used to recognize and reward the very goodness that made life worth living? He thought about Camila arriving in a few hours, beginning her routine with the same quiet dignity she brought to every day, never knowing that she had been tested, never suspecting that her simple integrity had shattered someone's cynicism and opened possibilities neither of them had imagined. The next morning, Alexander sat at his desk before dawn, writing and rewriting a letter that seemed impossible to get right. How do you apologize for testing someone's character without their knowledge? How do you explain that their integrity had saved not just their job, but something in your soul you thought was dead forever? How do you offer help without making it seem like payment for passing a test they never knew they were taking? Each draft felt inadequate, either too formal or too personal, too calculating or too emotional. He wrote pages explaining his past, justifying his cynicism, defending his actions. He wrote versions that were businesslike and practical, offering bonuses and benefits without emotional context. He wrote others that were raw and personal, confessing wounds and fears he had never shared with anyone. Finally, as the first hints of sunrise touched the windows of his study, he settled on something that felt both genuine and respectful, words that came from a part of his heart he had forgotten how to access. Dear Camila, there are moments in life when we discover that everything we thought we knew about the world and about ourselves was incomplete. Yesterday morning was such a moment for me. Integrity is priceless, but so is peace, and so is hope, and so is the knowledge that goodness still exists in a world that often makes us forget. You've given me all of these things, not because you were trying to, but because of who you are when no one is watching. I need to be honest with you about something that weighs heavily on my conscience. Yesterday morning, I witnessed something that changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The safe in my study was left open deliberately. It was a test, a cruel, unfair test that I am now deeply ashamed of having conducted. I have been betrayed many times in my life, and I allowed those experiences to poison my faith in human nature. I convinced myself that everyone had a price, that integrity was a performance people put on until the stakes got high enough. I was wrong, and you showed me just how wrong. When you stood before that open safe, you didn't see an opportunity. You saw a responsibility. When you could have taken money that would have solved your problems, you instead treated what you found with respect and care. When you thought you were alone with temptation, you chose prayer over profit, love over luxury. Your daughters and your mother deserve a life without the fear and stress I know you carry every day. Please accept the enclosed not as payment or reward. Your character cannot be bought or repaid, but as a thank you from someone who had forgotten how to hope and whom you reminded that goodness still walks quietly among us. More than that, I want to offer you something I haven't offered anyone in years: partnership. I would like you to consider becoming my head of domestic operations with a salary of $85,000 annually, full health insurance that will cover your mother's treatment, dental and vision for your entire family, and most importantly, the flexibility to care for your family without choosing between their needs and your work. I'm also setting up education funds for Sophia and Isabella, accounts that will ensure they can pursue any dreams they have without the burden of financial worry that has weighed on your shoulders for too long. But beyond all of that, I want to offer you something even rarer from a man like me: my trust, my respect, my friendship, and my sincere apology for ever doubting the integrity you demonstrate every single day. Sometimes the truest tests reveal more about the tester than the tested. Thank you for showing me who I want to be again, and for proving that the goodness I had stopped believing in was there all along, quietly cleaning my house and caring for my world with a grace I didn't know how to recognize. With deepest gratitude, respect, and newfound hope, Alexander. P.S. The safe was never really about the money, it was about faith, and you've restored mine. Attached was a check made out for exactly $50,000, the amount that had been in the safe, symbolically important because it represented not payment for a test passed, but recognition of integrity that had transformed a cynic back into someone capable of trust. Enough to cover her mother's treatment, her daughter's immediate needs, and a fresh start without the crushing weight of financial desperation that had defined her life for too long. But more than the check, more than the job offer, more than the promises of security, was something intangible but infinitely valuable. The recognition that her character had been seen, acknowledged, and treasured by someone who had forgotten how to value such things. When Camila found the letter on the kitchen counter that morning, her hands shook as she read it. She had to read it 3 times before the words truly sank in, before she could believe that someone had seen not just her actions, but her heart, her struggles, her quiet dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. The revelation that the safe had been a test hit her like a physical blow, not because she felt betrayed, but because she realized how close she had come to failing without even knowing she was being evaluated. For a moment she felt a flash of anger at the manipulation, at being studied like a laboratory specimen without her knowledge or consent. But as she continued reading, as the full context of Alexander's confession became clear, the anger transformed into something more complex: pity for a man so wounded by life that he had lost the ability to trust, understanding for someone whose experiences had taught him to expect the worst from people, and ultimately, a kind of honored sadness that her simple honesty had meant so much to someone who had given up on finding it. Tears streamed silently down her face as she held the check, more money than she had ever seen at once, more than enough to change everything for her family. But what moved her even more than the financial relief was the recognition, the respect, the acknowledgement that her integrity had been not just noticed, but valued in a world where such things often went unseen and unrewarded. She dropped into the nearest chair, overwhelmed not just by relief, but by gratitude for being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood the weight of the choices she made every day. Her mother's treatment, her daughter's school fees, the constant threat of eviction, it could all vanish. And not because she had begged or stolen or compromised her values, but because she had chosen to do the right thing when she thought no one was looking. Or so she had thought. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been most herself, most true to her values, in the moment when she believed she was completely alone. The test had revealed not just her character, but the fact that character is what you do when you think no consequences will follow, when no rewards await, when the only witness is your own conscience. That weekend, Alexander visited her small apartment for the first time, not as an employer making a house call, but as a human being stepping outside his fortress to connect with another person's reality and to begin building a bridge across the chasm his cynicism had created. The contrast between their worlds was stark and humbling. Her tiny 2-bedroom apartment, with its second-hand furniture carefully maintained and arranged with love, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator like priceless art, and the smell of homemade food that somehow carried more warmth than all the luxury his mansion contained, felt more like a home than his 43 rooms ever had. The apartment told stories. Sophia's honor roll certificates proudly displayed next to Isabella's crayon masterpieces, a small shrine with photos of Miguel that the girls still talked to each night, medical appointment cards organized on a bulletin board with military precision, and everywhere the evidence of a woman stretching every dollar to create abundance from scarcity. He sat at the small wooden table that served as dining room, home workstation, craft center, and everything else a family needed, playing board games with Sophia and Isabella, while Camila prepared a simple meal that somehow tasted better than anything his private chef had ever created. The girls were shy at first, whispering to each other in rapid Spanish and stealing glances at this unusual visitor who seemed too tall for their furniture and too formal for their casual world. But gradually, as Alexander listened to their stories about school and friends and dreams with the same attention he usually reserved for board meetings and financial reports, they began to warm to him. Sophia, the older daughter, told him about her ambition to become a doctor, like the ones helping her grandmother. Isabella, more artistic, showed him her drawings and explained the elaborate stories behind each character. Watching them, Alexander felt something crack open in his chest. A space that had been sealed off for so long he had forgotten it existed. These children, growing up with so little material wealth, radiated a joy and security that all his money had never purchased. They had something he had lost, the ability to find magic in simple moments, to trust in tomorrow despite today's challenges, to love without calculating the cost. He brought with him a folder filled with documents, not contracts or legal papers designed to create distance and protection, but house listings in safer neighborhoods with better schools, insurance policies that would protect their future, and college funds that would ensure the girls could pursue any dreams they developed. They spread the papers across the little table like maps to a better future, planning not just a job change but a life transformation. But more than money or opportunities, Alexander offered something that had become rare from a man like him: authentic human connection. For the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to be part of something bigger than his own protection, to care about someone else's welfare, not because of what they could do for him, but because of who they were and what they deserved. As the weeks passed, the relationship that grew between them transcended every category Alexander had previously understood. It wasn't employer and employee, though she worked for him. It wasn't benefactor and recipient, though he helped her family. It wasn't even simply friendship, though they genuinely cared for each other. It was something newer and more complex. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that integrity, real integrity, was indeed priceless and worth celebrating whenever it was found. Camila thrived in her new role, bringing not just efficiency, but warmth to the management of Alexander's household. She hired staff who shared her values, created systems that prioritized both excellence and humanity, and slowly transformed the mansion from a fortress into something that occasionally felt like a home. Her presence brought life to rooms that had been perfect but empty, conversation to hallways that had echoed with loneliness, purpose to wealth that had been accumulated but not meaningfully used. More importantly, she brought perspective, daily reminders through her presence that wealth without purpose was just accumulation, that success without connection was just isolation in expensive packaging, that security without trust was just a prettier form of prison. Alexander, for his part, discovered that generosity born from recognition, rather than guilt, felt completely different. Helping Camila's family wasn't charity. It was investment in the kind of goodness he wanted to see more of in the world. Supporting her mother's medical care wasn't pity. It was honoring the sacrifice and strength that had shaped the person whose integrity had saved his faith in humanity. The education funds he established for Sophia and Isabella weren't obligations. They were votes of confidence in the future, belief that children raised by a woman of such character would use opportunities wisely, and perhaps someday extend the same kindness to others who needed it. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander learned that the walls he had built to protect himself had also imprisoned him, cutting him off from the very connections that might heal the wounds they were meant to guard. Trust, real trust, wasn't about testing others to see if they would fail, but about being worthy of their trust in return. Elena's condition improved gradually with the better medical care that comprehensive insurance made possible. The experimental treatment that had been financially out of reach became available, and while cancer remained a formidable enemy, hope became a more frequent visitor to the family's conversations. Sophia and Isabella enrolled in a private school where their intelligence could flourish without the distractions of underfunded classrooms and overwhelmed teachers. Their new home, a modest house in a safe neighborhood with a small yard where they could play, became a sanctuary, where childhood could unfold naturally, unmarked by the stress that had shadowed their early years. Camila found herself in the strange position of having more than enough money to pay bills without anxiety, enough security to plan for the future, enough support to care for her mother without sacrificing her daughter's needs. For the first time since Miguel's death, she could breathe without calculating the cost, dream without measuring the practicality, hope without fearing the disappointment. But the relationship between Alexander and Camila's family deepened in ways that surprised them both. He became a regular presence at their dinner table, someone who remembered Sophia's test scores and Isabella's art projects, someone who brought flowers for Elena during her good days and sat quietly beside her bed during the difficult ones. The girls began to see him as something between a grandfather and a fairy godfather, someone who appeared in their lives like magic, but stayed because of love. They taught him things he had forgotten: how to laugh at simple jokes, how to see wonder in ordinary moments, how to receive affection without questioning its motives or calculating its cost. For Alexander, who had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted something from him, the experience of being valued simply for his presence, for his willingness to listen to stories, help with homework, and show up when it mattered, was both healing and transformative. He established a scholarship fund in Miguel's name at the local community college, helping other families facing similar struggles. He created a foundation focused on providing healthcare support for families dealing with cancer, ensuring that financial stress wouldn't compound medical crises for others as it had for Camila. These weren't tax write-offs or publicity gestures. They were extensions of the lesson Camila had taught him, that character reveals itself in what we do when we think no one is watching, and that integrity, once recognized and honored, tends to multiply and spread like light dispelling darkness. The test, cruel and calculated as it had been, had ultimately revealed truths neither of them expected. Camila learned that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when no one is watching, sometimes creates ripples that return as waves of blessing she never could have imagined. Her simple act of integrity had not only preserved her own character, but had restored someone else's faith in humanity. Alexander learned that the walls he had built to protect himself had also imprisoned him, cutting him off from the very connections that might heal the wounds they were meant to guard. He discovered that trust, real trust, was not about testing others to see if they would fail, but about being worthy of their trust in return. He learned that generosity rooted in recognition rather than guilt felt completely different, that wealth used to honor integrity rather than buy loyalty had the power to transform not just circumstances but souls. Most importantly, he learned that the goodness he had stopped believing in hadn't disappeared. It had been there all along, quietly present in people who chose to do right, regardless of whether anyone noticed or rewarded them. The grandfather clock still ticks in Alexander's study, marking time as it always has, but now its steady rhythm sounds less like judgment and more like hope, a reminder that every moment offers a choice, and that sometimes, when we choose to trust instead of test, to offer instead of withhold, to believe instead of doubt, we discover that the goodness we've been searching for was there all along. Sometimes the truest tests aren't passed with applause or recognition, but with quiet, unseen choices made, in moments when character is the only witness. Sometimes the richest people aren't those with the fullest safes or the largest bank accounts, but those who live in truth, act with integrity, and choose love over fear even when no one is watching. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, our tests reveal not just who others really are, but who we have the potential to become when goodness reminds us of our own capacity for grace, when integrity in others awakens the integrity we thought we had lost, when someone else's character becomes a mirror, reflecting back not our cynicism, but our hope. In the end, Alexander's test had been designed to expose Camila's true nature. Instead, it had revealed his own, and given both of them a chance to write a better story than the ones they had been living. The safe had been left open to see what she would take. What she had given him instead was infinitely more valuable. Proof that integrity still exists in a world that often seems to punish it, that kindness still matters in places where it's rarely rewarded, that second chances, when offered with genuine respect rather than cynical testing, can transform not just circumstances, but souls. The test had ended, but the transformation it triggered continued to ripple outward. Sophia excelled in her new school and began tutoring younger children, carrying forward the values she had learned from watching her mother choose integrity over opportunity. Isabella's art began to reflect themes of hope and family, her drawings showing houses with open doors and tables surrounded by people of different backgrounds sharing meals and stories. Elena's health stabilized enough for her to return home, where she became the family's anchor once again, sharing stories of survival and gratitude that reminded everyone what truly mattered. She often told visitors about the miracle that had saved their family, not just the money or the opportunities, but the recognition that doing right had been seen and honored by someone who had forgotten how to hope. Alexander's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The mansion that had been a fortress became a gathering place. He hosted dinners for Camilla's extended family, celebrations for the girls' achievements, quiet gatherings during Elena's treatment that brought together people who would never have met otherwise but found they shared fundamental values about what made life meaningful. He established mentorship programs that connected successful professionals with families facing financial hardships, creating networks of support that went beyond money to include guidance, encouragement, and proof that circumstances could change with effort and opportunity. Each program was designed not to create dependency, but to honor the kind of integrity that Camila had shown, to recognize and reward good character when it was found. The foundation he created in Miguel's memory grew beyond healthcare support, to include scholarships for children who had lost parents, job training for single mothers, and emergency funds for families facing sudden crises. Every initiative was guided by a simple principle: integrity deserves support, character deserves recognition, and goodness deserves the chance to flourish regardless of the circumstances that surround it. Years later, when people asked Alexander about the turning point in his life, the moment when isolation became connection, when cynicism became hope, when wealth became meaningful rather than merely accumulated, he would tell them about a morning when he thought he was testing someone else's character and discovered his own. He would speak of a woman who looked at $50,000 and saw only someone else's trust that needed protecting, who stood in the presence of temptation and chose prayer over profit, who demonstrated that integrity wasn't a performance for public consumption but a private commitment to being the same person whether anyone was watching or not. Camila, when asked about the same period, would speak differently. She would talk about the choice that everyone faces every day, to do what's easy or what's right, to take what we can get or protect what isn't ours, to see opportunity in others' vulnerability or to see responsibility in others' trust. She would remind people that the test never really ended, that every day brought new opportunities to choose integrity over advantage, honesty over convenience, character over compromise. The difference was that now she made those choices knowing that someone had seen her truest self and found it worthy not just of employment, but of respect, friendship, and investment in her family's future. The safe in Alexander's study remained, but it was no longer a symbol of protection and suspicion. It had become a reminder that the most valuable things in life, trust, integrity, character, love, couldn't be locked away or stolen, couldn't be bought or sold, could only be recognized, honored, and nurtured when they were found. Sometimes the truest tests don't measure what we expect them to measure. Sometimes they reveal not whether people will fail when tempted, but whether we will recognize goodness when it's right in front of us. Sometimes the richest discoveries come not from what we find in our safes, but from what we find in each other when we finally learn to see clearly. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, our tests become not endings but beginnings, not conclusions about human nature, but invitations to participate in the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of relationships we want to build, the kind of legacy we want to leave. In that world, integrity isn't tested, it's celebrated. Character isn't questioned, it's honored. And goodness isn't hidden behind walls of suspicion, it's given the space and support it needs to flourish, multiply, and remind us all that hope, even when it seems lost, can always be found again in the quiet choices of good people doing right things when they think no one is watching. The test was over. The transformation had just begun.